Welcome back to the next discussion piece that we have with you, which is around the whole research and evidence in Ireland based on drug use. We're joined at the panel by Anne Doyle, Deirdre, Mongan and Brian Galvin, who are from the Health Research Board. Indeed, Brian is working with us on the advisory group to support us through the process, and also joined by Owen Quigley, who's also from the European Monitoring Centre for Drugs and Drug Addiction, and we will have a panel discussion with all panellists shortly. But firstly, I'll be calling on Deirdre Mongan and Anne Doyle to make a 20-minute presentation, shared presentation, and I think Deirdre is up first. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So today I'm going to provide a very brief overview of drug use in Ireland, including how many people in Ireland use drugs, what drugs they use, how often they use them, how drug use trends have changed over time, and how we compare to other European countries. So first up, I'm going to start with a couple of very brief definitions. So when we describe drug use, we use the terms prevalence and patterns of use. In very simple terms, prevalence of drug use is the proportion of the population who use drugs in a given time frame. So for the purpose of this presentation, when I refer to prevalence, I'm referring to last year prevalence. So if I say prevalence is 8%, then that means 8% of the population used drugs in the last year. And prevalence is an important measure as it tells us how many people use drugs and allows us to monitor trends over time and to make comparisons. However, to get a fuller picture of drug use, it is important to have information on patterns of use, as it is generally a person's pattern of drug use that determines the likelihood of them experiencing drug-related harm. So for example, somebody using cocaine every day is much more likely to experience harm from their cocaine use than somebody using it every few months, and the same with other substances. So how do we measure drug use in the population? So the information we use to describe prevalence and patterns of drug use is mainly obtained through surveys, both of the general population and specific subgroups. And all the surveys that I've cited here today are done throughout Europe, including Ireland, according to best practice guidelines. So in Ireland, we have undertaken a national drug and alcohol survey approximately every 4 years since 2002, and to date we have completed 5 of these studies. Households are selected randomly, similar to the process used to select the members of this assembly, and this ensures that the participants in the survey reflect the demographic characteristics of the Irish population. In Ireland, we undertake 2 school surveys, the SPAD and the HBSC, and they've also been done every 4 years for the last 20 to 25 years. And these surveys are important because adolescence is a time at which many people start to commence substance use, and it's important to monitor changes in this group. Also, this group are particularly vulnerable to drug-related harm due to their relative mental and physical maturity. And finally, in recent years, web surveys have become a popular way of getting information from a large number of people who use drugs. And in Ireland, in 2021, Ireland participated for the first time in the European Web Survey on Drugs. And this asked almost 6,000 people who had used drugs in the last year more about their patterns of drug use and reasons for using drugs and so on. So the remainder of the presentation is focused on findings from our surveys. So I'm generally going to talk about drug use among adults, but when I talk about adults from a perspective of drug use, I'm referring to 15 to 64-year-olds. Generally speaking, those over 65 and over are very unlikely to use drugs, and generally speaking, we only can monitor trends and compare ourselves with other countries for this group. So here we have a breakdown of the Irish population according to the substances that they use. And while this assembly is focused on illegal drug use, it is important to be cognizant of the fact that much drug use takes place in the context of alcohol use, and people generally initiate alcohol use before they start using drugs. So in 2019, we see that more than 1 in 5 people, 22% of the population, didn't use any substances in the last year. And this has changed considerably since 2002, when just 16% abstained from all substances. We can see at the bottom, drugs only. Practically nobody used drugs in isolation, but 9% in 2019 used drugs along with alcohol, and this had increased from 6% back in 2002. And as you can see, alcohol is the substance that's mainly used in Ireland. So what type of drugs do Irish people use? So in 2019, 9% of the population aged 15 to 64, or 287,000 people, used an illegal drug in the previous year. And the most commonly used drugs were cannabis, ecstasy and cocaine. And these have increased in use since 2002. However, we see from our survey data that cannabis use has stabilised since 2014. However, we've seen quite large increases in ecstasy and particularly cocaine since 2014, albeit from a much lower base. So how do we compare to other European countries? So you can see here in relation to cannabis, we're very much around the European average. However, when we move to our stimulant type drugs, you can see for cocaine, we're fourth and higher than most other European countries. And when it comes to ecstasy, we're close to the top, with just the Netherlands reporting a higher rate of ecstasy use than us. Oh, sorry. Very sensitive. Okay, another change that we have seen in our survey data is an increase in polydrug use. And polydrug use is using more than one type of drug in the last year. So in 2019, we see that among people who use drugs, just over 1/3 or 34% used 3 or more different types of drugs in the last year. If we compare that to 2002, just 14% used 3 or more types of drugs in the last year. And when we look at our survey data, in 2002, practically all people who had reported the use of an illegal drug reported the use of cannabis. However, now we're seeing a much wider range of substances being used, and this has led to increases in stimulant-type drugs such as cocaine, ecstasy and amphetamines, also hallucinogenic-type drugs such as LSD, and also new psychoactive substances. So, as I mentioned earlier, it is important to measure patterns of drug use, as this can be an important indicator of drug-related harm. And now I'm going to concentrate on the most commonly used drugs: cannabis, cocaine and ecstasy. I will talk a little bit about problematic opioid or heroin use at the end of the presentation, however. So, in our web survey in 2021, over 4,000 people who had used cannabis in the last year completed a set of questions on their cannabis use and the different types they used. So we can see practically everybody who used cannabis said they used cannabis herb. Almost half, or 47%, used cannabis edibles. And these are food products such as biscuits, sweets, brownies, or drinks that contain cannabis. And these have emerged in recent years and are particularly popular among younger people. 23% used cannabis oil or extract, and just 20% used cannabis resin. And again, when we look at our other survey data, we see that the type of cannabis being used has changed greatly over the last 20 years. Back in the early to mid-noughties, cannabis resin was the main type of cannabis used, but around about from 2007 onwards, we see much greater increase in the use of cannabis herb. So I'm going to talk a little bit about patterns of cannabis herb use, as this is the most commonly used cannabis type in Ireland. So in our web survey, we asked people how often they used cannabis and also how much they normally used. So we can see here 35% are reported frequent use, and this is defined as use at least once a week. A further 24% could be considered intensive users, and these are people who reported daily or almost daily use. Sorry. Okay. This graphic shows a comparison of infrequent users who use herb a few times a year with intensive users who use it almost daily. And as you can see here, intensive users along the bottom, among those 37% use higher quantities of cannabis when they use cannabis, compared to just 12% of infrequent users who report using high quantities of herb when they use cannabis. And this is important to know because the international research would indicate that cannabis use quantity and frequency predicts the likelihood of them experiencing cannabis-related health problems. And one of the adverse health effects of cannabis use is cannabis use disorder, and this is a level of cannabis use that is causing psychological, physical or social functioning problems for the user. Our survey data shows that 1.4% of the Irish population aged 15 to 64, equating to about 45,000 people, meet the criteria of cannabis use disorder. Our data also shows that this is most common among males aged 15 to 34 years of age. Probably not surprising, as this is the group most likely to use cannabis. And of those who used cannabis in the last year, 1 in 5 or 20% met the criteria for cannabis use disorder. Moving on to talk a little bit about patterns of cocaine and ecstasy use. So 8% of those who use cocaine reported that they used it on a weekly basis. When we look at the amounts they used, we found that weekly users used double the amount of cocaine compared to those that used it less than monthly. So similar to what we saw for cannabis, more frequent users tend to use higher amounts. Ecstasy tended to be used much less frequently, with just 1% reporting that they used it weekly and 90% using it less than monthly. However, it should be remembered that this survey was done during 2021, while COVID restrictions were still in place, and this may impact on our findings because ecstasy use is often associated with use in nightlife and festival settings, which were curtailed at this time. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about problem opioid use in Ireland. And opioids include heroin, methadone, fentanyl and morphine. And problematic opioid use is a significant problem in Ireland and across the world. And problem use refers to use that is harming people or places them at high risk of harm. And compared with people who use other drugs, problem opioid users are often a hidden population and difficult to capture. So a different approach to our normal surveys is taken to measure prevalence of opioid use. So using international best practice guidelines, we use data from treatment providers, GPs, prison and probation services to come up with this estimate. So in 2019, we found that almost 20,000 people used opioids problematically in Ireland. And we can see here the breakdown that this is very much an ageing cohort, with almost 3/4 of people with problem opioid use in the 35 to 64 age group. And this differs considerably since 2006, and we can see major changes in the profile of the people who have problem opioid use. While the overall numbers are similar, we can see that in 2006, 1 in 5 people with problem opioid use were aged 15 to 24, compared to just 1 in 25 in 2019. And this is very encouraging because it shows that much fewer young people are using opioids in a problematic way. So at this stage, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Anne Doyle, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the profile of people who use drugs.
So thank you very much. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about who uses drugs in Ireland, to tell you a little bit about the age and the sex and regionally where people live, and then a bit about the socio-demographic or the socio-economic status of people who use drugs. So first up, I'm going to look at sex and age differences, and we know from the data that we have that males are about twice as likely than females to use drugs. But when we look specifically at the younger age group of 15 to 24-year-olds, that gap is closing there. Overall, 15 to 24-year-olds are the most likely to use drugs, but when we examine that by sex, we see that, in fact, it's actually the males aged 25 to 34 years who are the highest drug users in Ireland. And what we see here as well is that among the younger age group, they are starting to use drugs in their late teens, continue to use them into their early 20s. But for men, they continue to use them right through to their mid to late 20s, early 30s, whereas for females, you can see there that it really does taper off as the women age into 25, 34 years age bracket. So looking at the age of initiation of substances, I've included alcohol here as well, and we can see from this figure that there's been a delay in the age of starting drug use, including alcohol. So the bottom line there represents data from 2002, and the top line is the more recent data from 2019, and we can see that young people are starting to delay substance use. So that in 2002, it was 16 years of age. It's now 17. Cannabis was 18, it's now 19. Ecstasy was 18, it's now 20. And cocaine was 20, it's now 21. And the reason why we're looking at the age of initiation is because the earlier you start using substances, you're more likely to experience problems. So for example, there, if you start drinking alcohol at 15 years of age or earlier, you're 4 times more likely to develop alcohol use disorder than someone who starts drinking at a later age. Early cannabis use is a predictor for cannabis use disorder, as Deirdre talked about earlier. And early cannabis and early alcohol use is a predictor of future use of cocaine. So looking at the region that people who use drugs live in, just a reminder there that, as Deirdre said, about 9% of the population use drugs. But when we look at the geographic spread of people who use drugs, we can see that it is more concentrated in the Dublin area. It's 13% of the Dublin population use drugs, whereas it is evenly spread throughout the rest of the country. And looking at the socioeconomic status of people who use drugs, looking at the employment status, the student population and the unemployed are more likely to use drugs. So 17% of our student population use drugs, 14% of our unemployed use drugs, 8% of employed people use drugs, and 3% of those who are engaged in home duties use drugs. And when we look at drug use across society, we use data from the census, and there's a number of indicators that are used to determine the deprivation, including income, employment, and education. And the left of this graph here represents the most deprived areas, and the right is the least deprived area, or what could be called more affluent areas. And what you can see from this graph is that the 2 blue bars on either end of the scale represent the most deprived and the least deprived, and it's very equally spread. So basically the take-home message from that slide is that drug use is spread across society. And similar to the previous slide, when we look at specifically at cannabis use and specifically cannabis use among school children, we see that social class, again, does not determine whether a child uses cannabis. And in this instance, social class was determined by their parents' job. So among boys and girls, they were just as likely to use cannabis regardless of what social class they fell into. But where we see that cannabis use is common across all socioeconomic groups, what we do see is that problem cannabis use, such as cannabis use disorder, is higher among individuals with lower education levels. And when we look at the impact of drug use on communities, we can see here that it differs to the previous slides, where people from the more deprived areas are significantly more likely to report problems within their communities with drugs. So the first one here is looking at problems with using or dealing drugs. So you can see 44% of those in the most deprived areas reported a problem with using or dealing drugs in their area versus 20% of those in the least deprived areas. And similarly, so those in the most deprived areas were more likely to report experience or witnessing drug-related intimidation compared to the least deprived. So I've just put a few key messages. I'm aware that Deirdre and I have bombarded you with a lot of information there. So thank you so much for your attention, and please do ask us any questions. There's a lot of statistics in there, so we're happy to explain them further. Okay.